Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 30th of June. Today we have important changes that occurred on the Pokrovsk and Toretsk axes respectively. We also have changes around Vovchansk, and so we're going to focus most of the video on those three areas. Starting off with the region just to the west of Citadel, we see a continued Russian push along various roads and tree lines pushing towards the village of Karlivka. In the last video, we talked about how the Russian forces were able to push through this particular paved road and the accompanying forested regions under some Ukrainian artillery fire, and were able to occupy positions in some of the northern houses of Karlivka north of the reservoir. And so now there's a back and forth going on there. Further south, we also saw development of a new attack vector just today along the E50 highway, where the Russian forces were able to push through and also advance through the forested regions, get control over some of the dachas in the region. And this was again verified based on a video from June 30th of the 11th Battalion of the 59th Motorized Brigade, where they were responding to this Russian advance with a whole host of defenses, including shelling, dropping grenades onto the Russian soldiers individually, striking them with FPVs. And that gives us confirmation that the 11th Battalion is operating here, which is important to note because previously we didn't hear much from them in this region, which also means the 59th Brigade is involved in trying to contain the Russian advance, in addition to the other defensive units in the region, which I already talked about extensively, including at least a battalion of the 59th Brigade, elements of the 53rd Brigade over here, and then, of course, the elements of 25th Airborne Brigade. And so now this region is being beefed up, and the region around Karlivka is so important because the Russian forces advancing along this axis, they do have control over the highway which bisects Karlivka and then actually crosses past the Vovcha River. And a Russian sustained push in this region would put a lot of additional pressure on to the Ukrainian defense line that they're trying to build, and they're trying to buy time by putting up fierce resistance east of the river in order to prevent the Russians from gaining a foothold across it and to undermine the construction efforts before they are fully complete. I talked about this in the last video, and now the Russian forces are just continuing to capitalize on that, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they are present in Netalove. Looking further north, an area where we do have a lot of advances, as noted by Ukrainian sources. I saw Petrenko, for instance, update their map to indicate this. We saw a lot of Russian expansion in the region just to the northwest of Sokil. This comes again after, you could say, weeks and weeks throughout all of June, essentially fierce fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces on the outskirts of Sokil. Russian forces, they did take high casualties in the beginning when they were creeping through field to field in very shallow ditches, sometimes near ponds. There's a lot of videos of that I have marked over here to indicate as such. You had the Ukrainians moving in whatever reinforcements they had from the 47th Brigade to just try to maintain control of the region as they tried to prepare their backup, I guess you could say secondary line, in this case around villages such as Voskod and Yevanivka. And so they try to maintain the line over there, which again in turn leads to high casualties. The Russian forces mainly pushed along this paved road from Solovyov, which became an important hub for Russian armor. A lot of it also coming from the Ocheratina region, where Russians have moved in artillery, which again gives them an advantage, getting control over a dominant height overlooking the village of Sokil. The Russian forces did receive a lot of fire support from that region, and that again, the entire dynamic relating to elevation was really palpable as the Russian forces continued to advance under such cover. Again, a lot of the Russian gains here are as a result of the advance just to the north of Sokil through this trench fortress, which the Ukrainians did not make the most out of. The Russians captured it relatively quickly. And since then, we've now received the June 30th update, where the Russian forces were able to expand control even further westwards, you could say 1.2 kilometers, and take over the impromptu Ukrainian defense line set around, I guess this is a floodplain, or I guess a lower lying area where you have this perimeter with a bunch of tree lines, and that area definitely is defended. You can see some of those defenses mapped in yellow over here, trying to prevent a head-on assault. And so the Russians were able to galvanize on their previous gains and advance through these fields. And a lot of these regions where the Russians are advancing through are connected to the wider height on which the railway embankment is located. And just as a reminder, that region, of course, does dominate the elevation game, overlooking the Ukrainian fortresses in the region that we have marked over here. And of course, the final two remaining villages in the region just west of Sokio. I guess you also have Novoselivka Persha just to the east of the Vovcha River. But just even looking further east, those same positions on the railway embankment also do overlook other villages just specifically west of the riverbank in areas like Prochorez or Vovche. And so you have to keep in mind how that will play a role in operations later on. Some Russian sources are mentioning the capture of Yevanivka, which is a very small hamlet, and it's just an extension of Sokil. I can't confirm that. And you also do have the Ukrainians trying to organize tooth and nail around these trenches, and so we're going to have to wait and see if that actually comes into fruition. And again, south of Novo-Oleksandrivka, the Russian forces, they of course got solid control over most of that village, and so the southern flank became easier to access as a result, with Russian forces advancing from that railway axis, utilizing in some cases vehicles along the Cheratina road going westwards, and pushing towards various tree lines and some of the defenses the Ukrainians built up. You can see them all marked over here. And then again, the Russians are getting control over the northern fields that are an extension of the railway embankment, which helps them on a local level overlook villages such as Vovchansk over here, or even going northwards along this tributary, which is, I guess, an extension of the Toretsk River here, Timofivka. And so that is just looking into other villages that we haven't seen much on the playing field. Further northwards, again, you do have information of just slight Russian advances occurring in the areas directly west of Novo-Oleksandrivka, including an entrance into this fortress that the Ukrainians were trying to maintain control of. It's something that they were doing in a lot of these nearby villages. They're just like a massive stronghold that is adjacent to a road or adjacent to one of the entrances to the village. And the Ukrainians try to concentrate a force over there and utilize various firing points to just keep the Russians at bay. And after a lot of, I would assume, to be fire preparation artillery from the Russian side in the Cheratina region, they were able to eventually get a foothold here, and now they're trying to clear it out, which again is accompanying the Russian advance axis along this paved road going to the northwest. If we look at Russian reinforcements in this region that have recently popped up, there's actually some new units that the Russians have incorporated into their fighting around the Sokil region. And they mainly come from the 27th Motor Rifle Division, one of the main, I guess, large formations the Russians have in the post-Avdiivka region. And so let's just look at two of those actual units, 506th Motor Rifle Regiment and the 433rd Regiment. And so those two have been involved in a lot of those initial forays into eastern Sokil, for instance. And they, I would say, are the newer units, less experience, less equipment, definitely. As a result, they would yield higher casualties than some of the more experienced Russian units that are operating here, but they also played a role in some of those initial, essentially clearing the way for Russian vehicles to infiltrate into Sokil and then dismount larger squads. Now, looking at the Toretsk area, here we have two important pieces of information that I'm going to try to connect together. And the last thing that I'm going to mention is something that is unverified, and so I'm just stressing that from the get-go. What is absolutely verified is something that I don't know how I missed when making the last video. The fact that the Russian forces were actually able to capitalize on their advances from the past week around Shumi, or from previous positions in these various slag heaps or terracons in the northwestern Horlivka area, and then actually push through some of the Ukrainian fortified networks, forests, and actually infiltrate into the eastern residential areas of the suburb Zalizhny of Toretsk. And so this is something that was widely mentioned by Ukrainian sources and Russian sources alike. All the mapping is relatively similar. Some Russian sources are indicating full control over this gray zone region, which includes some cottages and additional trenches in forested regions. And then the Ukrainian side still has that area as, I guess you could say, open, more fluid, while they do acknowledge that there was a Russian infiltration into these residential areas, including many blocks reaching all the way to the end of this particular district along the supermarket region and approaching a part of Zalizhny. I don't even know if it's there anymore or if it reaches the suburb of Pivnishnya by that point. but it's this large apartment complex that the Ukrainians really do need to maintain control over. When you get an idea of the elevation, you'll understand why. Because the Russian vector of attack through this residential area is consistently through a hill that I guess you could say extends from the regions just north of Pivdenia, located over here. And you have some of those hills starting off in Shumi. There's a bit of a low-lying region in between in some of these forests that the Russians were able to advance through. And then that same higher elevated area extends northwards through the Zalizhnia area, through the apartments, and all the way to this particular, I guess, slag heap or mine dump. And that is one of the main vantage points for the Ukrainians that they still maintain. And of course, the Ukrainians built this sort of semicircle shape as a secondary defense line over the years, especially, I guess you could say, in the past 2 years. You could see that shape taking form. I'll show you guys with these lines over here. You can see how that shape is taking form, and it sort of extends from Pivdenia in the south all the way to Pivnishnia over here in the north. And it includes control over that vantage point in order to give Ukraine a very good line of sight into any sort of Russian forays through residential areas or through the fields that are directly surrounding Shumi. But in any case, it is surprising to see the Russian forces able to penetrate an area of the front line. May not be the most fortified region in this entire Toretsk axis, but you could see the defenses that were built up, many of them built over the span of 10 years. And then, of course, the Ukrainians having natural barriers, including the hill on Shumi, which they lost, including the forested regions that were just pummeled by TOS-20 fire on June 25th, which was the preparation for the actual Russian assault. And then actually infiltrating into these residential areas. Let's actually look at the extent of the advance, measuring it from where the, I guess, 2014 line was. The Russians were able to push nearly 3 kilometers to the northwest, and this was done in rather quick succession, pushing very close to the secondary defense line that the Ukrainians have in the region, and very close to some key strong points that the Ukrainians were probably hoping to have a bit farther away from the front line for additional weeks or months. And you could see that now with the fact that they're only about 1.6 kilometers away from that Terrakon. Another issue that I see forming is regarding the Ukrainian force in Pivdenia. You could see the area just south of the Russian spearhead is still under Ukrainian control. But besides this mine dump over here, all of the area south of it are on a river plain of the Zalizhnia River running over here. And that includes basically this entire blue salient that you see marked, where there are various Ukrainian defenses, and the fact that the Russians have now been able to flank it from the north and create this sort of salient makes it harder for the Ukrainians to defend over there, and could force them to push or to really try to consolidate a more solid defense line further westwards directly to the east of Zalizhnia. And so the Russian forces do have an opportunity to put pressure in that region, in the same way that they have the opportunity to put pressure on this gray zone region and continue pushing along the higher elevated regions deeper into the suburbs of Zalizhnia and northwards into Pivnishnia. That it is a large concern. The main goal for the Ukrainians likely is to maintain that secondary line you see in yellow, but also to prevent the Russians from getting a foothold, a permanent foothold in the residential areas, which could become a reality if the Russians could solidify control over this gray zone, which would give them a more solid access to the particular district. Now, things get more interesting when you look at what Russian sources are covering today, June 30th, where they actually claim that there were operatives of the veterans detachment. That's how the Russian sources are referring to it, which I would say it's essentially the equivalent of some of the mercenaries from Wagner Group that, of course, was then disbanded and then incorporated into the Russian MOD apparatus. And so it sort of is acting as a successor in that way in terms of some of the core members that are operating in it. And so there's just mention of this veterans detachment taking a active role in the region that is just to the north of Shumi. And what's being claimed by Russian sources, and this is not verified yet, I'm hoping that we can get either a debunking or confirmation tomorrow, but it is in relation to specifically an advance through a tunnel that these Russian soldiers discovered. What's being claimed is that they discovered an old tunnel underground that runs for 3 kilometers. Let's actually try to measure 3 kilometers to get an idea of where this could potentially have been located. And the claim by the Russian side is that they were able to use this to sort of flank the Ukrainian main stronghold in the region. And the Russian source explicitly mentions that the water, I don't know if it's water tunnel, you could say, but the actual tunnel was running along the Donbass Canal, which is located over here. And so, at the very least, it started there, and perhaps it would be a part of Russia's efforts where they were able to capture the pumping station in the region. Maybe they found an older abandoned pipe and then used that as a springboard. But again, that is highly put into question until further notice. And then looking at how far away it is from the Russian claims on their particular mapping showing the Russian advance, it would only be around 2 kilometers westward. So I don't know if there's any sort of turns along the way that extended the distance, but that's what the Russians are saying. They were able to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions, specifically around this stronghold they refer to as Kirov. And Kirov, I believe, is a strong point located in between Druzhba and Pivnichnya, which is basically divided by the rail line area. So it may be at the intersection between the two of them at this junction point over here. And it's mentioned that the Ukrainian defenders here, they have these underground bunkers. They have very important firing points. And it's also a part of some of the heights that are extended in the region that overlook some nearby fields. And so it really is an important region. And so there's an understanding why the Russians would want it under their control. And it would make sense for the Russians to push in this region, given how they already have an axe developing along this highway. And they were able to already get control over some of the first residential areas. But the claim being made by Russian sources is an advance that would look something to this amount, and that is something that has to be, of course, highly scrutinized. What is interesting is that if this were to be the case, it would mean that the Russian forces are not only putting pressure on the Terrakhon in Pivnichnya from the south, where they advance to the residential area, but in conjunction would be putting pressure from the northeast along this rail line. So really do keep an eye out for those specific developments, because the Russian soldiers, the Russian sources were adamant that they were able to capture that point, and the Ukrainians either surrendered or withdrew. And so we're going to keep an eye out for that in the next video. And one last thing that I would briefly add is, given how the Russians have been able to continue advancing following the movement of the 28th Mechanized Brigade to sort of seal gaps, specifically in the area northwest of Mayorsk, it does seem like the Ukrainians may have to move in additional reinforcements. I don't know from where they would have to. It would likely have to be from a different part of the front line and not from any sort of strategic reserve they have. And just look at some of the other units around here. It's very, very scant. And that is a big part of why the Russians were able to advance through areas that, at least on paper, should be highly fortified. Looking further north, I need to update the map, but this is basically verified by both sides now. The fact that the Ukrainians have been able to continue pushing east in the Serebryansky forest. I believe that the National Guard units involved are the 12th Azov and the 1st Bereev brigades. Those are the two doing it. And we're able to get control over some of these very, very forested areas running along the Donetsk River in the region. I'll just mark it with blue for you guys to show the sphere of control as the Ukrainians try to gradually chip away at whatever Russian positions are left in the northeastern part of the forest. And I believe it's a part of the Ukrainians trying to extend the buffer zone east of the Jerebets River to make it essentially impossible for the Russians to advance past that natural boundary. Looking further north at the area south of Vilshana, this is an area that it actually is elevation-wise pretty important for Ukraine, because just east of the entire Oskil River Valley, which you see going down here vertically, there is this just massive ridge that the Ukrainians control. And it's played a big role in overlooking the Russian forward positions in an area like Vilshana, for instance. And now the Russian forces, they're in this process and have been for a very long time of just trying to gradually advance through these open fields, but it is just a very exposed area. The Ukrainians, of course, do have the height advantage in this specific region, but they can't utilize it to its full extent because they don't have many large troop concentrations in the region, because, again, it is just open fields, some ditches, and then you go further south and you have this line around Kupiansk, is eastern suburbs like Petropavlivka. But nonetheless, we have this video of Russian forces. I think this is, yeah, June 25th actually, and so I should have mentioned it earlier. But it shows the Russian artillery and FPVs just raining fire down on one Ukrainian strong point in one of the first ditches that the Ukrainians tried to defend from the Russians. And that intense bombardment first caused the Ukrainians to hide under some of the concealed regions of the trenches, but the 10-man squad eventually had to flee, and they did so through the tree lines under intense Russian artillery bombardment. By the end, they abandoned it, and you had a Russian vehicle that was armored and camouflaged dismount in the trench region, and the Russian soldiers cleared it out. And so that should give you an idea of how the Russians infiltrated this first ditch. There was an attempt on the 28th of June to counterattack. The Ukrainians used a BMP-1 in the ditch area, probably mounted with soldiers to try to take it over, flank it. And then you had Russian FPVs and grenades involved in destroying that, and so to say Ukrainian BMP-1 in the ditch area. But in terms of other natural barriers, the Ukrainians do likely still control the remaining part of this ditch over here. Basically, any field that is in between these ditches is located on a hill that's overlooking them. And so besides the protruding ditches, most of this field region is just on a massive ridge. And then looking further south, you have this one other ditch before you reach the Petropavlivka region several kilometers southwards. Now, looking at Vovchansk, it's very interesting to see how both sides are really capitalizing on the success they're having in the urban battle, because both sides did recently advance in certain regions. So the Ukrainian side, for instance, they've not yet commented on the events of June 30th to a large degree, but there has been a lot of talk of how they were able to push from the Vovcha River and advance several hundred meters northwards in an attempt to cut off the corridor connecting the main Russian downtown force near the hospital to the aggregate plants. So that's a lot of what I'm seeing on the Ukrainian side. And then the Russian side, they're focusing on a specific event that occurred very recently, either starting, I guess I would say, on June 28th and extending into June 30th, you could say. And this is based on Ukrainian and Russian footage alike that has been geolocated. First, we're going to start with confirmation that the Russians do still control this very narrow corridor. And so, of course, it is being fired upon 24/7 by either side, but the Russians maintain a physical presence along the road leading into the aggregate plants, which they have not withdrawn from. And we could actually see some of those footages over here. We can see the video here. It's from June 30th of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto Russian positions that are near the highway that basically goes north-south. And you could see that a lot of those roofs that the Russians are occupying, or the houses, the roofs are just completely open from all the damage. And so Russian soldiers trying to hide, in a lot of cases, they're being exposed to grenade fire from above. And there's not much they can do in those cases. But at least physically, we know that they're still operating in those regions. And then looking just slightly north, this is something I mentioned in my last video, and I said this would basically be the key to whether the Ukrainians could maintain successful defense or the Russians could essentially clear out the northern parts of Vovchansk. And that is this large apartment complex consisting of like 24 of various apartment blocks. And it's an area that, since the beginning of the urban battle, the Ukrainians have maintained control over, using it for ATGM fire towards the roads that are going vertically southwards, or using it for snipers, recon, drones, whatever it may be. It has so many advantages in an area like Vovchansk, where there generally is lower elevation in some of these floodplains, river valleys, some of these residential areas that the Russians are congregating in. And so the Ukrainians really do have that advantage. And it's a big part of why they're able to fire upon any sort of Russian force that is advancing southwards near this highway, or that is trying to establish itself within the aggregate plants. And of course, dislodging those Ukrainian forces head on is extremely difficult. And so now we're beginning to see reports. First of all, there's the unconfirmed Russian information, which it's hard to believe until we get any sort of confirmation, of course, that there was an attempt by the Russians to flank the complex from the south, and that they were able to get a foothold via that southern flank. What we do know based on geolocated footage is that the Russian forces got a foothold in the northern part just south of Korolenka Street, which the Ukrainians use that street, this horizontal street, as a sort of dividing line to prevent any sort of Russian incursions further south. We know this based on the video from June 30th, which shows Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto those same apartment buildings, confirming the Russians are operating there albeit under the Ukrainian fire, as they're trying to prevent the Russians from turning it into a permanent base. And then this is the very interesting video from the 29th of June. It shows a really, really intense urban engagement. I don't know which Russian unit is involved. I've seen some claim that it may be the 2nd Spetsnaz Brigade, which is a Spetsnaz force that was involved in repelling the Belgorod raids in March. And since then, we don't know what it's been doing, whether it's been fighting in Vovchansk. We don't have any sort of publicly available information on that, but they generally are floating around this Kharkiv Belgorod region. And so it would be interesting to see them involved in combat. In any case, this geolocation shows a Russian squad go from this region over here. I'll mark it for you guys and cross over Saborna streets, reach the ruins of one of the westernmost apartments of the complex, which was already largely in ruins. And from there, you could just hear in the background so much intense firing from both sides. But the Ukrainians are stationed in some of these higher stories, and they're firing down towards the Russians. And nonetheless, the Russians try to advance through those ruins, and they try to climb up and get a foothold within it. And the video just shows it. I don't know whether it was dawn or dusk, but it was pretty dark outside, and you just have the Russian squad continuing to advance through and gaining a foothold there. And so this was a head-on operation through the perimeter, first the northern perimeter, but also the western perimeter, to try to undermine the Ukrainian positions here, which I'd say in part the Russians were able to do this because of the Fab 3000. I don't think I've seen specific footage of 3000s being dropped over here, but they're being used all over Vovchansk now, and it just seems logical that a lot of the damage caused to Ukrainian vantage and firing points would be done by the 3000, which again, when dropped from a Su-34, could just cause so much damage to one particular concentrated area versus some of the lower yield bombs. And that could have paved the way for the Russian ground forces to actually be involved in fighting here. And seeing this Russian activation recently really is important, because we just saw 2 days ago information. I'm not sure whether it actually did start with Russian sources, but it circulated into Ukrainian channels mentioning a withdrawal of the 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the fighting in Vovchansk following 3 weeks of fighting in the downtown region and near the apartment complexes. And so some Western media sources were reporting this, and I don't know if that's true, but just 2 days later, we're seeing now the Russians try to reactivate the fighting here and take over a key node. And so I don't know if that's a form of deception or just poor timing, but either way, that should give you an idea of where the battle currently stands. Last thing I'm going to say is we have a slight change around the Khliboke area. First of all, we know the Peaky Blinders unit, Ukrainian drone units, is still operating here, and they were able to drop a grenade onto a Russian soldier on this road east of Khliboke. So they're still operating and targeting Russian soldiers. But then we had this video from the 92nd Assault Brigade. One of these other units moved from the Klishivka area generally, and they released this compilation of various FPV strikes onto Russian infantry that were firing towards the western approaches to Khliboke. So they're really guarding that western perimeter, and they're doing so in whatever remains of the houses. They're just in complete ruins, and so the Russians don't have that much concealment. Sometimes they're hiding in dugouts or basements, and that's when the Ukrainians spot them and hit them with FPVs. But the video itself gives us confirmation that the Russians are still in control of the entirety of Khliboke, and the Ukrainians remain in these tree lines just to the west. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.